Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for your interest and for being here with us as we share our presentation and hear about our trip to the Holy Land. We're going to start with a little background on how our journey came to be and how we traveled. And then we will move to a story-supported walkthrough of our journey. So as you will hear, it was indeed an exciting and impactful trip. We are doing a hike through the nature reserve in northern Israel. There were 22 of us in all, 17 from here with WPC, and then 5 extended family members and friends. Today you'll hear from each of us as we share our experience.
Hello, I'm Kathy Matsushima, and I have a story to tell. It was 4 years ago, in 2019, when a handsome young man from Charlotte, North Carolina, joined our church. Several days later, I met that man already helping to cook chicken for homeless in our church kitchen. "Hey," said the voice of Joe Avalar, "you two should get together. You both have so much interest in the Holy Land. People here have been wanting to do that for years." CW had just completed a trip with about 50 Presbyterians from Charlotte.
Well, you click where
I had been to Israel a number of times, and soon we agreed to show movies and read books and see if there really was interest here. Soon John Morgan joined us and certainly made it a much more rich program. On Sunday afternoons, we frequently met with Zoom because of the number of people who could not reach it any other way, and that worked very well. And one of these was a pastor from North Dakota who was particularly helpful. Then came COVID. Just as we were all ready to go, we had our money packed and we had our suitcases packed, we had to cancel a few days ahead. 1 year later, once again, we failed with the same session. This, her third time, it worked. Everything we saw was beautiful and meaningful, and we enjoyed every bit of it. We would especially like you to realize that we've been talking about the trip for the whole last few months. And now we want to share it with you. So please, thank you. Please, and thank you for joining us.
I am C.W. Sachs, and I did not write the introduction. But after discussions with several pastors in Charlotte, we decided to work with Sunlight Tours. Sunlight Tours is an organization that was started by a retired Lutheran pastor, and it is co-owned by the guy that was with us, Ian Weiss. One of the things that really helped make our pilgrimage so memorable and so enriching for us was the background of our guy, Ian. Ian is a Palestinian. He lives on the Mount of Olives. His family has lived there for 3 or 4 generations at least. He's also an Israeli citizen, which was very helpful. He actually spent his junior year in high school here in the States, and he loved it so much he came back for college and he graduated with an engineering degree. And after being an engineer for about 10 years back in Israel, he decided what he really wanted to do was be a tour guide and share his love of Israel. I'm so thankful that he did. Ian really was a teacher. One of the things he repeatedly asked us almost every time we went to a new site is, "What do you see?" And he would usually follow that with, "Look again." And pay attention to the detail. Or sometimes it'd be just look all around you and take everything in. But he really helped make us become observant and become critical thinkers and to understand and appreciate the things that we were seeing. And he also encouraged us to ask questions, and that's something we did a lot, not only when we were at the sites we were visiting, but when we were traveling on the bus. its knowledge of both Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is such that one could easily make a case that he was devout Christian, Jew, or Muslim. He really helped us understand and appreciate the history of the land, about the culture, about the people, both at the time of Christ and even now. And he really helped make us become pilgrims rather than just tourists. He was just terrific. And we also had a wonderful bus driver, Omar. We were constantly amazed at how he was able to navigate the bus on some narrow streets and on some hilly roads that allowed us to get very close to the sites and not have to do any more walking than was necessary. But he really was remarkable. So then the next slide. So after we arrived, late in the evening, we went to our hotel, which was a wonderful hotel right on the Mediterranean Sea. We were able to sleep in late the next morning, have a wonderful breakfast, and walk on the beach because it turned out there was a Tel Aviv marathon right in front of our hotel, and our bus couldn't get out of the parking. But as soon as that was over, in the late morning, we were running off on our own, and that's when our journey really began.
Well, here you can see by the red dots, the many places that we visited on our journey. Wow. We first made our way north through Galilee to the border with Lebanon and into the Golan Heights. Then we traveled south to Bethlehem and Jerusalem that served as our base from which to explore many sites, particularly in the West Bank. For reference, Israel is about the same size as New Jersey. All of our travel between sites was on our bus, and every day we followed a similar ritual. Especially meaningful was to read a scripture at each site. At the end of the day, just before dinner, we gathered as a team for a time of singing, prayer, and a chance to share and reflect on our experiences of the day. Our daily ritual also made for an additional benefit of our journey. It was our fellowship among our 22 travelers. And often we would ask in our time together, where did you see God today? And we had wonderful experiences. So we will explore this journey in three parts. First, in his footsteps, following the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. 2, the historical sites in the Holy Land before and after the time of Jesus. And then 3, today in the Holy Land, where we meet with several Christian and Palestinian organizations looking for a good way in this challenging environment. So let's begin by looking at the places we visited that Jesus would have known in his lifetime. Nazareth is known as the town where the Virgin Mary, aged around 14, agreed to become pregnant with the Son of God. It also became the hometown of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph after they returned from fleeing to Egypt to escape Herod the Great's soldiers. The Church of the Annunciation is the largest Christian church in the Middle East. It is a modern building that stands over 2 earlier churches, one from the 1st century and another from the 6th century. In the crypt is a cave that is traditionally held to be the home of Virgin Mary. Here it is believed the Archangel Gabriel told Mary that she would become the mother of the Son of God. The site, inside and outside of the church, contains images of Mary from countries all around the world. This image is an image sent from the United States.
I am Lynn Savitas. Bethlehem. The Church of the Nativity is in Bethlehem in the West Bank. Within the church is a grotto, a structure made to resemble a natural cave. This grotto holds major significance to Christians of many denominations as the birthplace of Jesus. It is marked by a silver star. The grotto is the oldest site continually used as a place of worship for Christians, and the church itself is the oldest major church in the Holy Land. The church was originally commissioned around 330 CE by Constantine in honor of his mother, Helena. After it was destroyed by fire in the 6th century, Byzantine Emperor Justinian built a new church with some additions while preserving the original character of the building, including some of the original and elaborate floor mosaics. The surrounding compound now covers about 3 acres, including a monastery for each of the 3 religious communities responsible for the church and its worship: Roman Catholic, Armenian Apostolic, and Greek Orthodox, as well as bell towers, terraced gardens, and a pilgrimage route. 6 miles south of Old Jerusalem, inside the West Bank of Palestine, and within the suburbs of Bethlehem, one will find the Shepherd's Field. Within half a mile of each other, there are 2 hillside fields known by this name, with archaeological evidence to support both. And little doubt, the angels could be heard by the shepherds in either field. Today, the Church of the Nativity, about a mile away down in the village of Bethlehem, can be seen from both fields. The Greek Orthodox site, open only to groups with reservations, is known for its red dome. It is built above Byzantine-era remains believed to be a church built by Queen Helena in 326 CE. The Roman Catholic site, more visited and tourist-oriented, also has evidence of Byzantine-era remains, a monastery from the 4th century, and caves with tunnels and rooms. In 1954, a tent-shaped chapel, known as the Church of the Shepherds, or the Sanctuary of the Gloria in Excelsis Deo, was built above the ruins. Frescoes inside depict the Nativity of Jesus and the adoration by the shepherds. A bronze-aged angel at the entrance serves as a welcome and a reminder of that holy night.
Hello, I'm Nancy Now, and I'm covering Galilee, beginning with Cana. Cana, along the road from Nazareth to Tiberias, was the scene of Jesus' first miracle, where he changed water into wine. That is John 2, verses 1 through 11. Our group photo was taken in front of the church of Cana, which housed the large 4 by 3 foot stone water vessel depicted in this photo. While present in the church, I imagine what it must have been like when Jesus and his first disciples turned up at a wedding feast, probably that of a close relative of his mother Mary, and the wine ran out. Yet Jesus humbly rejoiced and changed 6 of these large vessels, holding the equivalent of 730 bottles of water, into fine wine, and rescued the hosts from embarrassment. The Mount of Beatitudes. This is one of the most serene and enchanting vistas in all of the Holy Land, overlooking the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee. It brought about a sense of overwhelming peace to me as I imagined what it must have been like to hear the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, verses 7 through 28. And this is marked by the current site of the 8-sided church, built in 1938, symbolizing the 8 Beatitudes. Jesus' sermon was radical and countercultural and called Israel to a new way of life. It is at this place where Jesus met his disciples after his resurrection and commissioned them to go out into the world and spread the good news. Matthew 28, verses 16 through 20. Galilee. Beginning with Capernaum, was located in the Sea of Galilee and became Jesus' hometown during his ministry. This beautiful, rural, hilly area on the shores of the Sea of Galilee is where Jesus spent most of his ministry in just a 3.5 square mile area. Capernaum was the scene of many of his miracles involving the healing of the sick and the possession of the devil. Was also the site of the home of the first disciples that Jesus called, including Peter, and it is where Jesus worshiped and where he taught in the synagogue. Mark 1, verses 21 through 22. Reflecting on the town of Jesus was particularly interesting to me as a nurse practitioner whose role involves healing the sick and teaching, and these were 2 primary roles that Jesus carried out in this place, which was the center of his ministry in Galilee. Peter's house is pictured here as seen through the glass excavation site. This 19 by 21-foot house is believed to be where Jesus stayed during his ministry in Galilee. Today, an ultra-modern Catholic church perched on 8 sturdy pillars hovers over Peter's house. As a person who enjoys hospitality, I was imagining Jesus as a guest lodging in Peter's house. Coming out of the church, I was awestruck by this modern sculpture entitled Homeless Jesus, with the inscription, as you do unto the least of these, as you do unto the least of my brothers, you do unto me. Matthew 25, verse 40. This served as an important reminder to me what Jesus makes clear in the parable of the sheep and the goats, that how we treat others is important to God. We are called to perform ordinary acts of compassion in daily life. Tabgha, at the foot of Mount of the Beatitudes, was a tranquil, favorite fishing spot with warm salter springs where I could easily imagine Jesus speaking from a boat with crowds sitting around him on the shore. It is here that Jesus appeared for the 3rd time to his disciples after his resurrection. He tested and commissioned Peter as leader of the church, and where he fed the multitudes with the multiplication of the loaves and fish to feed 5,000. From Matthew 14, verses 13 to 21. For me, being in this place was a serene location for meditation and prayer. The Byzantine mosaic at the altar in the modern church of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes stands on the site of a 4th century church and depicts this miracle story.
I'm Ellen Peters, and I'm going to tell you about Magdala. Magdala was a major port on the Sea of Galilee and was likely the home of Mary Magdalene. The ruins of a 1st century synagogue were discovered there in 2009, the oldest synagogue excavated in Galilee. Researchers continue to excavate the ruins of a substantial town. The stone shown in the picture, which is a replica, the real one I think is in a museum in is likely the earliest depiction of the Second Temple. It was so exciting to realize that scientists are still finding and learning more about these amazing historical sites of the Bible. Since Magdala was a wealthy town with an important synagogue, it is very likely that Jesus preached here. The Gospel of Matthew says Jesus went to Magdala by boat. The picture you see of a boat is the altar in the main chapel of Duc in Altum. The name of this lovely place refers to Luke 5, verse 4, where Jesus tells Peter to put out into deep water. Looking out beyond the altar, you see only water, the Sea of Galilee, and can imagine Jesus coming to shore here. You approach the chapel through the women's atrium, a tribute to the role of women in Christian faith. The domed ceiling of the atrium is supported by 8 pillars of rose-colored stone. 7 pillars are inscribed with the names of biblical women who followed Jesus. The 8th pillar is unmarked to signify women of all time who love God and live by faith. The chapel on the lower level contains the painting you see here, titled Encounter, showing the moment when the hemorrhaging woman in Mark 5 reaches out to touch the cloak of Jesus as he passes in the crowd and is immediately healed. The beauty and peace of this spot found a place in my heart. I will never forget it.
Sea of Galilee. On a peaceful afternoon before sunset, our WPC pilgrims were deeply moved when we privately received communion, officiated by Pastor John, on a similar style fishing boat to what Jesus would have told parables from on the Sea of Galilee, as described in Matthew 13, verse 1 through 9, and also where he walked on water. We broke bread together and received the cup through these little wooden vessels of salvation from, and they're made of olive wood. And the cups were gifted to us by our stellar guide, Iad. The peace of Christ was very much felt in this place. The Jesus boat, pictured here, was excavated over an 11-year period in 1986, where it was discovered during a drought in a muddy lake bed, and it dates back to 120 BC to 40 AD, during the time when Jesus and his disciples would have spent time in this region. We enjoyed our stay in the resort hotel pictured on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, surrounded by mountains.
Caesarea Philippi was the center for the worship of the Greek god Pan. This cave you see here was thought to be the place where Pan entered the underworld. At that time, water flowed directly from the cave, and the pagans believed that this was the gate of hell. We visited on a Sunday, and after touring the ruins, we gathered in the shade below them, next to the river. We had a worship service based on Matthew 16:13-20. Jesus brought the disciples 25 miles from Galilee to Caesarea Philippi. And here he asked them, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" Then Jesus asked, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter confessed, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Then imagine this. Here in the shadow of the grotto of Pan, Jesus said to Peter, "Peter, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gate of Hades will not prevail against it." Jesus challenged them to build a church that would overcome the gates of hell and evil, a church that would embody his message of the kingdom of God.
Hello, I'm Sarah Cogan, and this is about Jericho. On March 1st, leaving Jerusalem on Highway 1, we went east to Jericho, the world's oldest city, some say. En route, we passed bleak Bedouin settlements, looking out the bus windows at the extremely sandy, dry countryside. We passed a sea level sign at the end of a very steep descent to Jericho, which Omar navigated very well, as always. We also passed many date trees that look like palm trees. The Jericho medjool dates are well known all over the world and are very prized. They date back 6,000 years in the Jericho Valley. In Jericho, we saw the sycamore tree to honor Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was the little man who wanted to see Jesus as Jesus passed through Jericho. So Zacchaeus had to climb the sycamore tree so he could see him. And then Jesus came to his house. According to some tests, that tree is 2,000 years old. We drove through the streets of Jericho en route to the Jordan River. And for the oldest city, it's amusing to see how many products advertised are from the New World. There were Coke signs, KFC signs, and McDonald's signs everywhere. Jericho had been in the news for distressing and violent incidents between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and we could see smoke, you can see, from nearby houses, but our bus was not stopped. Our guide had said, "Well, maybe they caught the guy." You get rather immune to violent incidents, not unlike those of us living in the United States.
After visiting Jericho, we drove to the Jordan River, to the possible site where Jesus was baptized by John. We had a service of renewal of baptism, using water from the Jordan. Pastor John came around to each of us and poured some of the water into our hands. Then we walked down to the river, where a stretch of decking provides access to the riverbank. Some of our group waded in the water. There was another church group there who were wearing white robes and preparing for immersion. The Jordan here is muddy, surrounded by reeds, and not very wide. It did not seem very dramatic, but when we thought about what had happened here, it could hardly be more spiritually important. In addition to being the most likely spot for Jesus' baptism, this is the site where the Israelites crossed the Jordan after wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. It is also the border between the Holy Land and Jordan. So we could see another country just on the other side, where people also visit the baptismal site.
I'm Mike Salidas, and I'm going to talk to you about the Mount of Olives. We arrived at the top of the Mount of Olives, taking a short walk down a path that overlooked Jerusalem. It was striking to see the city below us, just as Jesus might have seen it. Granted, Jerusalem has been destroyed and rebuilt since that time, but you could sense that feeling of Jesus standing there weeping over the city. We went down the steep, winding road, making a stop at a small chapel where the rock was located, where Jesus may have prayed on the night he was betrayed. We continued down the winding road past the garden, now looking up at Jerusalem towards the gate where Jesus would have entered the city on Palm Sunday. We had completed the path Jesus may have taken that day, as he would then went across a small valley and up into the city.
I'm Bob Archibald. One of the last days we were in Jerusalem, we visited 3 sites that played a prominent role in the last days of Jesus' life: the upper room, the Garden of Gethsemane, and the dungeon at Gallinantu. We searched the Bible for a description of the room for the Last Supper. We find Mark and Luke use the same words, calling it a large room upstairs. The room we saw fit this description. The room was upstairs and clearly was a wealthy person's house. It was big and the columns and marbles were impressive. The house in the upper room is just outside the old city walls of Jerusalem. After the Last Supper, Jesus and his disciples took a considerable walk down into the Kidron Valley and back up the Mount of Olives to the Garden of Gethsemane. Gethsemane means olive press. And part of the Garden of Gethsemane, which remains today, is a walled-off square filled with very old olive trees. All 4 of the Gospels mention Jesus' visit and prayers in the garden. So several of us had "I'm walking where Jesus walked" moment right here. The final picture here shows John doing a reading in the dungeon of Gallinantu. The Bible is silent about where Jesus was taken after his encounter with Caiaphas, the high priest. The dungeon-like pit in the area near Caiaphas' palace has traditionally been believed to be where Jesus spent the night before his trial. Hewn out of solid rock and very deep, it was a chilling place, a spot to remember the suffering servant Jesus.
I'm Julia Smith. Via Dolorosa. The original Via Dolorosa, or the Way of Sorrow, or the Way of Suffering, was established during the Crusades in the 13th century. It has changed over the years, but the present one was probably established in the 19th century. It represents the path Christ would have taken on his way to the crucifixion. It's about 2,000 feet long and winds through the old city of Jerusalem. As you can see, the arch over the beginning of the Via Dolorosa is wider than it is in some places. It's wider than narrower, and it breaks up into pieces. So it's nice to have a map so you know where you're going. There are 14 stations along the way, and some are enumerated with Roman numeral plaques and relief of what might have occurred there. And Hans is showing you that as long they're high. Others have chapels at the different stations. 9 of the stations are mentioned in the Bible, and 5 are considered traditional and are presumed to have happened according to the Roman Catholic Church teachings. The last 5 stations are in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The stone path meanders through town and in some places very narrow with busy shops on either side. Although it seemed sacrilegious to me, but it was probably very representative of what was going on at the time. During Passover, there would have been a lot of shopping. There would have been hundreds of more people in the city. So it would have been very busy when Christ was making this walk. Our group picture is taken at a Franciscan monastery with a nun from the Covenant of the Sister of Zion.
who was acquainted with Peg from our group, who was a friend of Kathy's from Chicago. The location is between Station 1 and 2. Tradition says that Christ braced himself against the wall while carrying the cross. And so many people that pass that station will place their hands there on the rock.
As Julia said, the final sites of the Via Dolorosa, or the Stations of the Cross, are within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Visiting the church is overwhelming in so many ways. To begin with, the church is not simply one building. It encompasses a multitude of holy sites and chapels built and rebuilt in bits and pieces over nearly 2,000 years. Up a narrow stairway, just to the right of the entrance, are 2 small chapels. The first contains a mosaic of Christ being nailed to the cross while his mother looks on. The second is the chapel of the crucifixion, where you can kneel and touch the rock of Calvary where the cross was placed. It's hard to describe the sensory and emotional overload of standing in a slow-moving line of people. One man in front of me made the passage on his knees, elbow to elbow with fellow pilgrims waiting to see the place where Christ was sacrificed for our salvation. Everywhere you look, there are paintings, sculptures, mosaics, lamps, decorations of every kind. Overhead, there are vaulted ceilings covered with beautiful mosaics, saints, people from the Bible, plants, animals, ships, angels, all on a dark blue background. Descending from Calvary, you make your way to the final station, the site of the tomb where Jesus was laid. This is enclosed in a small stone edifice located beneath an immense rotunda with a shaft of light descending from a window in the central dome. The rotunda's outer walls date back to the Emperor Constantine's original basilica built in the 4th century. Opposite the tomb is the central worship space, the Catholicum. Ownership of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is shared between the Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholics, and Armenian Orthodox. Each has control of different parts of the church. 3 minor Orthodox communities, Coptic, Syriac, and Ethiopian, have rights to certain areas. It is a sad symbol of the fracture of Christ's Church Universal that different religious communities continue to vie for control over these sacred places. Right down to the ladder you may be able to see in the exterior photo, which hasn't been moved since 1757, when the Ottoman Turks imposed an agreement regulating control of the site. Despite these distractions, and despite the crowds of tourists, this holy place was a spiritual high point of our journey for me. The Garden Tomb. The precise location of the tomb where Jesus was laid after the crucifixion is not known. The Gospels say Jesus was crucified near, but outside of Jerusalem, and was buried in a new tomb hewn out of rock in a nearby garden. The site of the Garden Tomb was identified in the 19th century, based on the cliff you see that looks like a skull and the existence of the right sort of tomb. It tends to be preferred by Protestant pilgrims over the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Recent scholarship is clear that this cannot be the actual tomb of Jesus. We found this to be true at many of the sites we visited. After 2,000 years, we just do not know the exact places where Jesus carried out his ministry. I decided that for me, it really did not matter. What mattered was that Jesus was here, if only nearby, and seeing the sights made real for me the scenes of Jesus' life. The fact that everywhere we went, we saw other pilgrims from across the world reverently visiting sites that have been venerated by Christians for 2 millennia made it even more special. So despite the authenticity question, I found visiting the Garden Tomb a very moving experience. The tomb is surrounded by a lovely garden, perfect for prayer and contemplation. Our group had communion together in a small section of the garden, then went inside the tomb a few at a time. It is easy to imagine Mary Magdalene encountering the risen Christ outside.
Now we will shift our focus to look at historical sites we visited in the Holy Land from the time before and after Jesus. Jerusalem, Temple Mount. In Jerusalem, I was awestruck by the Islamic Dome of the Rock. Stone covers a slab of stone sacred to both Muslim and Jewish faiths. Mohammed ascended into heaven here, and Abraham was agreed to sacrifice Isaac. Dome of the Rock is what the guidebooks call the most photographed building in the world. I added 13 photographs to my collection. I'm not willing to delete any of them. I have taken photos of other religious buildings, St. Paul's Cathedral, Notre Dame, Chartres, and of course, the Williamsburg Presbyterian Church. But the Dome of the Rock's location, its importance, size, brilliant reflection in all lights, symbolism, and gorgeous tile were mesmerizing. We never went inside, non-Muslims are not permitted, but in the sunlight of a quiet, peaceful morning, it was a spellbinding sight. The Western Wall. I was very envious of the incomparable western form of the Wailing Wall, which are the remains of the second temple compound. This is perhaps the most recognizable symbol of Judaism. To prepare for our visit, I had made a list of relatives to pray for. It was moving to join the other women who were assigned a certain section of the Western Wall for prayer and to slip my prayer list into one of the cracks in the wall. There was comfort knowing that even when my sheet of paper was removed, it would be put in a case and buried with other recent prayer requests. I envy this powerful symbol of faith and history.
I'm Tom Mao. I'm going to tell you about the Tel Dan Nature Reserve. This was one of the most northern points of our trip. The reserve was almost at the border of Lebanon. In fact, later that day, we drove to the border. The visit to the reserve gave us a chance to see the beauty of our Father's creation. It was a lovely forested area with lots of hiking trails. We saw snow on the nearby Mount Hermon. We saw the rushing stream of the Dan on the left, which is fed by the melting snow that is the largest and most important source of the Jordan River. We saw a cultic or ritual site which brought to mind biblical stories of the golden calf. I think most of the pilgrims were drawn to the trip to be able to walk in Jesus's footsteps, but Israel was where most of the Old Testament took place as well, and I wanted to make sure we didn't miss some of those historical sites by focusing on Jesus. But as we'll hear, Israel is a place where cities are often built on top of other cities, and so there's probably not too many sites left from that date that far back. But in the nature reserve, we were rewarded with some of the old sites. We saw 2 gates or fortified entries into fortified towns that dated to the Old Testament. We first visited the Israelite gate, which was the entrance gate to the town of Dan. It was dated to almost 1000 BC. We then saw the older Abraham gate, an ancient gate into the earlier town from the Canaanite period, about 1700 BC, or almost 4,000 years old. It's called Abraham's Gate because it is believed that Abraham passed through this gate with his men on his way to save Lot and Lot's family after they were captured by the people of Dan. Constructed of mud bricks, the 22-foot-high gate consists of 3 arches built on top of each other and flanked by 2 towers. Experts in classical history have believed that the Romans invented the arch, but Abraham's Gate predates anything the Romans built by over 1,500 years.
Right there.
Hi there, my name is Mike Smith. I'm going to introduce you to a couple of historical places, Megiddo and Masada. Yeah, look at that. So Megiddo is architectural TEL, which defines a small hill built upon previous structures over many centuries. And this tell rises about 60 meters above its surroundings. It's named in the book of Revelation as a setting for a future battle between the forces of good and evil. And for archaeologists, perhaps the most important site in Israel, dating from biblical times. The remains of at least 20 cities built one on top of another, dating back to 6000 BC, have yielded temples, lavish palaces, massive fortifications, private houses, a grain silo, and an elaborately engineered water system at this 15-acre site. I want to tell you about the water system. It's a vertical hole hammered out of the rock, going down about 150 feet, and then it goes back about 200 to 300 feet to connect into a river. And so it brought water up in there, and when you were up on top of this, you were secure. Nobody could get up. You had grain, you had water, and you controlled this valley. Megiddo is located approximately 50 miles southeast of Tel Aviv at the southern end of the fertile Jezreel Valley. From its strategic position overlooking the key pass through the Carmel Mountains, it dominated the crossroads of ancient trade and military routes that linked Egypt with Mesopotamia and Asia Minor. Armies of all the great generals who campaigned in the Middle East marched across the plain of Jezreel, including the Egyptian pharaoh Necho, who slew Joshua at Megiddo, Alexander the Great, the Crusaders, Napoleon, and British General Edmund Allenby, who defeated the army of the Ottoman Empire at the Battle of Megiddo in 1918. That led to the Allied conquest of Palestine and some of the irrational borders that you see drawn in the area over there. Thutmose II, who led the Egyptians at the Battle of Megiddo in the 15th century BC to conquer Canaan, stated that capturing Megiddo is as good as capturing 1,000 cities. So that gives you some insights into the strategic nature of that location. 20 cities over the time, and they dig down into it, they keep finding different historical cultures. Masada. So just take a look at that. This is a rock top fortress, a mountain complex 60 miles southeast of Jerusalem at the southwest tip of the Dead Sea. It is unlikely a more desolate, hostile, rocky setting in the Judean desert could have been chosen for one of the most famous tourist sites in the world. Herod the Great was appointed king of Judea by the Roman Senate about 40 BC and was in power when Jesus was born. Although Herod had the support of the Romans, the Jewish people did not accept him as he was not fully Jewish. As a result, Herod never felt safe in his role as king, so he built huge palaces and forts all around Judea to give him a sense of royal power and security. It was Herod that ordered the execution of all males less than 2 years old when he learned the birth of Jesus, a rival king of the Jews. Masada occupies the entire top of an isolated mesa. So a mesa is kind of a flat mountaintop area. The butte-shaped mountain plateau towers 1,500 feet above the level of the Dead Sea. We actually ascended it in like a cable car. We rode up, there's a famous height where you can walk up that way. We didn't do that. We rode the cable car. Its summit is an area of about 18 acres, fortified by walls, gates, and towers. Herod planned Masada as a refuge in case the Jews should rebel against him, or if he was attacked by the Egyptian pharaoh Cleopatra, who coveted Judea. Elaborately designed, it cascaded in 3 tiers down the cliff face. So you can see that. See the different levels, top, middle, lower, and the 3rd level was the final area for defense. And the only way to get at him was through like a little wall with a bunch of angry soldiers in front of us. There were bathhouses, swimming pools, food storage, armories, and barns. And to supply water in this arid setting, there was a sophisticated system that channeled water from winter rains into huge cisterns. And, you know, this, you can see it's rocky, barren, dry. When it would rain, it would flow down through cracks and crevices, and they channeled that into these huge cisterns that was the water supply for them. According to Josephus, well, in 66 AD, at the beginning of the Great Jewish Revolt against Rome, which I wasn't familiar with, a Jewish splinter group called the Sicarii overran the Roman garrison stationed at Masada. By then, Herod had been dead for 70 years. Rome responded to this rebellion with force, and once the Roman governor Lucius Flavius Silva had conquered Jerusalem, he took the 10th Legion to Masada in 72-73 and laid siege to the fortress. 8 fortified camps were built around the base of the mountain. As you stand up there, you could look down and see them. And and then the Romans began building a ramp of natural bedrock, which was constructed to reach the summit. Up the ramp, the Romans rolled an iron sheathed siege tower with rapid fire catapults and a huge battering ram to breach the fortress walls. According to Josephus, when defeat was inevitable, the leader of the Sicarii gave 2 impassioned speeches persuading his companions to cast lots to kill each other rather than be taken prisoner. When the Romans stormed the summit, they found the bodies of 960 occupants. The only survivors were 2 women and 5 children who had hidden in a cistern. Now, some question Josephus' account. Modern historians favor a more chaotic climax at Masada, with some Sicarii fighting to the death, some taking their own lives, and others trying to hide and flee. A research report concluded in 2016 that the ramp was not completed and therefore was not used to capture the fortress. Regardless, this is an unbelievably fascinating place with great historical value that will be studied and visited forever.
Qumran and the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is the lowest place on Earth at 1,411 feet below sea level. It is a salt lake that borders Jordan and the West Bank of Israel. Qumran is in the wilderness on the western bank of the Dead Sea. Qumran was a type of commune or monastery for the Essenes, a very religious group of Jews who went into the wilderness to study the Jewish scriptures and law as they awaited the end of the world. When the Romans drove them out in AD 68, they hid their precious scrolls in the surrounding caves. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest known copies of Jewish scriptures, were discovered by sheep herders in 1947. The Dead Sea is one of the saltiest bodies of water in the world. It is a unique experience to float in the water buoyed by the salt. They also sell mud from the sea for its special qualities, and several of our brave pilgrims took a dip in the Dead Sea.
Caesarea Maritima. We enjoyed spending time at this attractive Mediterranean seaport where Peter baptized Roman centurion named Cornelius, the first recorded Gentile convert to Christianity. While sitting in the ruins of the amphitheater, pictured below, I was imagining how the gift of the Holy Spirit caused believers in Jesus to speak in tongues, thus validating that salvation was for all people. This is in Acts chapter 10. I also thought about how Pontius Pilate left this headquarters for Jerusalem, where he sentenced Jesus to death, and how Paul was imprisoned here for 2 years. It was interesting to imagine this seaport as the center for Christianity in Palestine, and the place where it was determined that Easter be celebrated on a Sunday, way back in the year 195 CE.
All right, I'm Martha Jean Winnichuk. I'm going to start the talk with a focus on today in the Holy Land. So we're going to shift our focus from history to look at what we saw happening today in the Holy Land. Of course, on a church trip to the Holy Land, you'd expect us to visit sites related to Jesus and see the rich history of this place. For many of us, the greatest impact of our trip was visiting people living and struggling in a place so often in the news. Let's start in modern Jerusalem. The markets in Old Jerusalem were interesting. Walking through Old Jerusalem provided a range of opportunities. In addition to experiencing the Stations of the Cross on the Via Dolorosa, we squeezed our way through the maze of narrow streets, packed with crowds to explore a myriad of small shops. At one jewelry shop, several of us splurged on Jerusalem crosses and memorabilia, a fortuitous experience. Within steps of leaving the shop, two of our group got separated going left as the rest of the group went right in search of spices. It was actually myself and my roommate. So many of them purchased spices at a small stand where the colorful aromatic spices and blends were kept in small bins so we could try samples. Meanwhile, the two of us lost, made our way back to the jewelry shop, whose owner had a phone and was able to call our guide and reunite us with the block. Bethlehem is really an open air prison, where you feel strained coexistence between Israeli, Jewish, and Palestinian populations, and experience the Holy Land with water and population control. The exploitation of routine access to water for political and population control is really eye-opening. The Israeli government actively rations water to the Palestinian community. We heard that Palestinian farmers have limited access to water for their land, and that land left fallow for 3 years is confiscated and lost to Palestinian owners. We learned to scan horizons, rural and urban, to identify buildings with water tanks on their roofs. Those cisterns collect rainwater for Palestinian residents who receive limited quantities via the public water system. In the museum at the walled off hotel, and that is what that hotel calls itself, and the wall, a Berlin style wall, is literally just on the other side of the sidewalk there for that hotel. In that museum in Bethlehem, we saw a display of water types for Palestinian residents and Israeli Jewish residents. Those for Palestinians are decades old, mineral encrusted, and not legally permitted to be replaced, thereby reducing water flow capacity to less than 2 inches in diameter. Water pipes to Israeli Jewish communities are new and easily a foot in diameter. If we think about the West Bank and Gaza, both are open air prisons. I really did not know what to expect on this trip. I was concerned about our safety, especially considering recent events. Even my concept of the landscape was way off. Imagining deserts, it was amazing to see the many areas that are lush with crops of oranges, dates, bananas, almonds, and persimmons. And in the markets, there were strawberries that were just immense. My mind associated Palestinians with terrorists. The majority of the news that we read about Israel and the West Bank is about the conflicts and the dissent. But as our guide Iyad reiterated, most of the Muslims, Jews, and Christians who live in the land want to live and work together in peace. This is difficult with a physical wall surrounding the West Bank and the checkpoints with many rules and regulations to control who can enter and exit and where they can work. But there are many people in both Greater Israel and the West Bank who are devoting their lives to make peace a reality. That said, the two-state solution that we hear about so much in our news is OBE. It's a myth. And one of my souvenirs was this placemat that I bought. And what's interesting to see is this is 1947, before the partitioning. The green areas are Palestinian, the white are Jewish. At partitioning, this is what was done. So you see the Jewish areas as white and these green areas as Palestinian. After the '67 war, the Palestinians have these two areas. And why I say the two-state solution is OBE is because now what's happening, you hear in the news about Israelis going into the settlements. They're piercing this entire green area. So there isn't really a physical area that's contained enough to allow it to be a state. They take over the water, the farmlands, the buildings, and they're totally eating up what was a Palestinian state.
There were three other places that we visited that were very, very interesting. The first one was Weam. You can see it spelled up there, which means cordial relationships in Arabic. And it's a Palestinian conflict resolution center located next to the Bethlehem Wall, founded by Zobi Zobi, and that's his name. And you saw some of the graffiti in one of MJ's slides. The wall is absolutely filled with graffiti, and it's the back wall of this center. Make hummus, not walls. A memo about the insecurity checkpoint. A walnut tree in the backyard up against the wall. There's a sign reading, "Will this walnut tree drive the walnuts?" The mission is to create a culture of acceptance of others as they are through engaging in conflict transformation and empowering civil society while attending to critical needs for the social, political, psychological, and economic well-being of the community and its members. The second place we visited was the Tent of Nations. And the Tent of Nations is an amazing farm owned by the Nasser family, who are Palestinian Christian farmers. The Nasser family has owned the land for over 100 years and have been fighting for over 30 years through the legal system to retain control of their land. The farm is surrounded by Israeli West Bank settlements. And countless times so far, the Tent of Nations has been attacked. Thousands of trees have been destroyed and damages of over 150,000 euros have been caused. The Nasser family's lives have been threatened several times. For safety, we met in an underground cave. They're really not allowed to build structures above ground. Nevertheless, they live without aggression, according to the motto, "We refuse to be enemies and hope for a better future." They try to overcome their obstacles, challenges, continuous destructions, and the attacks on their lives in a peaceful, nonviolent way based on their Christian values and trusting in God's justice. Third place was called the Mar Elias Educational Institutions. Our visit with Father Elias Shakur, who's somebody that Kathy has known for many, many years, was another highlight of the trip. Kathy was eager for us to meet this remarkable man who's now 83, a Palestinian Arab Israeli, whose home is in the Arab village of Ibelin near Nazareth. Upon our arrival, Kathy greeted him warmly with a traditional Palestinian kiss of peace. Father Shakur is a three-time Nobel Peace Prize nominee, is a peacemaker, educator, and the founder of schools serving 2,700 young people from preschool through high school. He has been a priest of the Melkite Greek Catholic Church since 1965 and was the Archbishop of his region from 2006 to 2014. Driven with his family from an Arab village, which was later destroyed in the 1948 war, Father Shakur has built an international following with his mission to bring Palestinians, Christians, and Jews together. He touched our hearts as he spoke, inspiring us with his faith, humor, passion for peace, fundraising ability, and optimism. Pilgrims come from all over the world to meet with Father Shakur. And until his health deteriorated, he traveled widely seeking financial and moral support. And he has relationships with churches in the US. A nonprofit established in the US has helped raise funds for his peace initiatives. After our talk in Father Shakur's office, he guided us through his church, the Church of the Sermon on the Mount. It's an absolutely majestic building, and it serves as the chapel for the schools of Dublin. Important American donors to the church building project are recognized with a bronze plaque, an angel, and a child pointing toward a map of the United States with their finger on California. As part of our tour, he let us go behind the altar to the holiest part of the church. The exhilaration of being a part of a deeply religious space with Father Shakur was a moment we will not forget.
Then I repeat how wonderful this is for those who've been preparing and hoping and dreaming for all this, and here it is. I'm going to be telling you about something called Siraj. And in Arabic, it means lamp or light or light of the world. This comes from all the oil lamps that people used to use in their homes in this part of the world. Probably few of us did know the original meaning of the word. But by late in the afternoon on March 3rd, we had a bright picture in our hearts. That insight came from our inspiring meeting with Lori and Esteban Salome, a married couple from Chicago, one of them an American and one of them Palestinian, who had also a beautiful young family. And when the roads were too distant, too difficult to do right on the day they were supposed to have met us, they did meet us. They came to where we were in our hotel and they stayed with us and surprised us and allowed us to not only see them, but to see their beautiful children. They came to Israel in 2005 to fill a dream that I had long heard from them about what they would love to do with their life. They worked with isolated Palestinian villages and refugee camps to establish libraries where there were none at all. These libraries in poor countries, poor locations, became community centers and sources of energy and hope for the residents after these were built. They also created storytelling, an old Palestinian tradition, as their current focus. Today, there are 15 libraries, each run by the residents themselves and guided by Lori's executive leadership, helping them each time. Both of these folks have had a whole lot of academic credentials, and I knew them when we were all in school in Chicago. Esteban has a PhD in urban planning and in public policy from the United States. Today, he is the advisor to the Palestinian Prime Minister for planning and for aid coordination. We got a few moments with him on his own, but most of the focus continued to be on Siraj. Their funding generally comes from US individuals and churches, and the headquarters are in Oak Park, Illinois. Peg Griffith, who was one of the trip as a part of our team, and I are both founders of this group and current board members even now. We work alongside the Palestinian partner board that Lori and Esteban have now created. In other words, there is one in that part of the world and there is one in the United States. And much of the money that is needed to buy these thousands of different kinds of things come from the United States, and they are very, very grateful from the churches and the various places where this happens. Civic education it says on the little brochure, is based on the belief that civic education is the best route to justice, to human rights and peace, and the future of our children. We believe libraries build great communities and that all the people have the right to enjoy safe and beautiful public spaces. I just want to add that in the back of the table here, that has been laid out behind you as where you're sitting, on the red side with the red tablecloth, are copies of both that program that we just saw with the 4 parts of the nation changing. And it also will be a place where you can find all kinds of opportunities to read more about these places and even perhaps continue to give them something. And just feel free to take it, whatever you see and whatever you would like to know. Thank you.
This is about the Christmas church at Bethlehem. We chose the Evangelical Lutheran Christmas Church in Bethlehem for Sunday services on March 5th. Because it was in this building where we would have meetings and lunch with Palestinian Israeli Christians after the service. A bit of history about this church. German and English missionaries arrived in Palestine around 1845. It was a time when Protestants were building schools and churches to provide support for the local Christian community. This Evangelical Lutheran Church was built in 1893 at the urging of Augusta Victoria, the wife of the German Emperor William II. But the moment I walked into the sanctuary, I was moved to tears that just would not stop. The emotional impact of worshiping in the Evangelical Lutheran Christmas Church was because I felt so far from home, very much at home. The minister, Dr. Gunther Isaac, age 43, welcomed us in English before switching to Arabic. At the end of his sermon, he gave us a summary of the message in English. It was also the very Protestant music, the lusty singing, the warmth and kindness of the congregants, and the sunlight streaming in through the windows that reached my heart. Nancy Mall's sister Barbara sang the Lord's Prayer. The organist, as Norman often does here, switched to the piano for the offertory, and the minister picked up his guitar and played along with the piano. We had English bulletins, with some Arabic included. Pastor Isaac, who was an engineer before he was called to the ministry, is the academic dean of Bethlehem Bible College in Palestine, and the author of several books that give the perspective of Palestine Christians in the West Bank. He and his family visited with us over lunch, a splendid feast served by church members. Our WPC group was divided into professions and partnered with Lutheran church members. They shared their experiences as Palestinian Christians. At my table was Sami Abu Ghazaleh, a leader in the tourism program. His mood was one of despair regarding his and his family's present circumstances. But he did not, however, want to be separated by long distances from his now grown children. Hence, he would never think of immigrating to a more welcoming part of the world.
In addition to traveling in his footsteps and exploring history and meeting with our fellow Christian brothers and sisters, we had fun. And we also went swimming in the Dead Sea, which I think John mentioned, but in these pictures, starting in the upper left and going clockwise, we have a simulated Bedouin sword fight between Karen and me, and I won and she forgave me. And we danced afterwards, and then we had lunch with the Palestinian family. 3 of us had birthdays on that trip, and the guy presented us with a wonderful cake that we were able to share with everybody and celebrate. We had a wonderful wine tasting at a boutique winery in the Golden Heights, and we stayed long enough to be able to sample several different varieties. And then we have 3 Yes, Bob, Tim, and Michael, who are simulating 3 monkeys and I'm not quite sure why. Jaffa sits on the Mediterranean coast and is one of the oldest port cities in the world. It's from Jaffa that Prophet Jonah embarked on his faithful encounter with the whale. It's also where the Apostle Peter received a vision that changed his mind about accepting Gentiles into the early Christian church. When I returned from my trip in 2019 with my former church in Charlotte, the first Sunday I was back, I was sitting in the pews, and the scripture reading that John read was from Acts, and it was that scripture when the centurion came to Jaffa to get Peter to take him to baptize a Roman centurion in Caesarea. And all of a sudden, the Bible went from being black and white to me to being in living color. And that has happened a number of times for me, and I believe that's also the case for many other pilgrims as we experience Christ and the love of Christians from around the world in this very, very special place that we visit.
So in closing, our trip was a life-changing experience, to say the least. We listened to scripture in a new way with the images and places we visited in our minds. We were moved by the stories of living stones, the people that we met there, and now have a new appreciation for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We bonded together with our fellow pilgrims through worship, meals, fellowship, and a shared experience of the Holy Land. We thank you for letting us share this experience with you and hope that it has brought you a fresh understanding as well. And as our guide, Iyad, would often say, think simple. Are we good? Are we okay? Thank you so much